Web Applications in .NET 6 with Andrew Locke.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient and able to deliver world-class results. ClearMeasure is hiring architects and .NET engineers who'd like a path to become an architect, and so you can go to clearmeasure.com/careers to find out more information. Our guest today on the show is Andrew Locke. He is a senior software engineer at Datadog. He's working out of Devon in the UK, and he's a Microsoft MVP. That stands for Most Valuable Professional. He's the author of ASP.NET Core in Action and has an active blog all about his experience working with .NET and ASP.NET Core. Andrew, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks very much. It's good to be here. I'm good, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. I'm really glad to be able to interview you because there's a lot of people that used to blog, but not only writing a book, but you actually keep up with your blog, and many of my colleagues have mentioned how useful your blog posts are, and when they search for things, they just come right back to some of the posts that you've put up there. So I want to ask about it. What keeps the joy of blogging going for you when so many people have gone to the micro-blogging and social media, sentences?
Yeah, well, it's for one thing is having people saying how much value they get out of it. That certainly is a driver for it. But to be honest, I started blogging as a way of learning ASP.NET Core, just because having to write things down means you actually have to know a little bit of what you're talking about. So it sort of prompted me to dig into it, and I have this sort of inability to drop things halfway, so I've been doing it every week now for 6 years. But part of it is just the joy of learning more things and putting something out there. It's quite rewarding.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about your book also, because not many people write books. I think far less than 1% of the world's population ever writes a book. But leading up to that, I always like to ask, what are the high points in your programming career that kind of steered you in the direction that you're going today?
Yeah, well, I started relatively late. It wasn't until I went to university that I was really interested in programming at all. I dabbled a little bit with BASIC. Back my dad tried to convince me to play it, but it didn't interest me. Getting numbers on the screen didn't do anything for me. It was only when I got to university and we started having courses. It was in C and C++, and then design patterns, and that's where it really sort of sparked my interest. And so I started doing as many courses of that as I could at uni, and carried that on for the next few years to like masters and PhD and things. But it was always just on the side. It was only then when I started to do the jobs were all about programming, and that was when I discovered .NET. And suddenly .NET was so much easier to work with than C++, and trying to do visual things with C++ was painful. So that all steered me towards .NET. And then moving on from there, so I had a couple of jobs with that. And one of the jobs, so it was around 2015, 2016, was doing ASP.NET development, but with a Mac. So you were always working on a Mac in parallels in a VM. So you always had the difficulty with that, trying to work inside a VM all the time, all conflict with the shortcuts. And that's when ASP.NET Core started to be sort of really talked about as this Project K or vNext. And that's when I got really interested, because suddenly it meant I wouldn't need to have a VM anymore. I could just work directly on the Mac and it would be fine. And so that's when I decided to start the blog, to look into it. And from there, that's where the Manning reached out after seeing the blog, and went from there.
Okay. So your book ASP.NET Core in Action is out there, and it's been out there for what, I have to look at 2-3 years.
Yeah, there's a second edition now, so it's.
Very nice.
I understand. I can't remember the first one.
Very nice.
The first one came out about in the 2.0 era, and then the second edition covers .NET 5.
Awesome. So I want to ask, just because I know that a lot of listeners probably have this question and they're not clear. Can you kind of go over .NET Core, and now we have .NET 5, .NET 6. Can you demystify that just so that everybody knows how to think about all these different names that are running around now?
Yeah, there's a lot of things here. So .NET can mean a lot of different things. Back in the day, there was the .NET framework, which is the old Windows only, the stable but bloated, shall we say, framework, which is what everyone outside of who aren't on the .NET Core sort of bandwagon at the moment, that's what people think of a lot of the time when they're thinking about .NET. It's the old .NET framework. .NET Core was a reimagining of that, which was meant to be extracting just the core parts to make it far more composable, cross-platform, cloud ready. So it runs on Linux, it runs on Mac, it runs on Windows. And that was pulled out in sort of 2016, I think was the first release. And so that was .NET Core 1.0. And then there was some iteration on that, 1.1, 2.0, 2.1, 3.0. And after they got to .NET Core 3.0, they realized they had a problem. If they released .NET Core 4.0 and
Right.
you have .NET Framework 4.x, there's all these issues are going to arise. So they decided basically with the next version after .NET Core was just going to be called .NET. And part of the impetus of that as well is to signify that .NET Framework is essentially done. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to be, as long as Windows is around, it's probably going to rely on .NET Framework. So you can, if you've got your apps which are sat there, you don't have to touch them. But realistically, the future of .NET is in .NET 5 and .NET 6. So .NET 5 is essentially .NET Core. .NET 6 is still .NET Core, but it's the future of .NET.
That's a good point. With Microsoft's always had a commitment to 10 years of support. And so when they ship a major version of Windows, it happens to have .NET 4.8 in it, that resets a new 10-year time clock of support.
Yeah, exactly. So you really don't have to worry about your applications, which you can just ignore to an extent. But then there's always that danger. If you ignore an application, it just has a tendency to rot. So
all the libraries that it depends on top of those things, change or go out of support. Got to think about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's much more of a tendency now. I think people are far happier to leave .NET Framework behind in their libraries, because frankly, it's a big drag on, especially like open source maintainers. Including .NET Framework support can be quite difficult. I mean, you can't use any of the new span of T sort of performance things. You can't use any of the new APIs around channels or what else that's coming in the latest versions. So while you can be safe if you literally don't need to touch your application, if you are actively developing an app, you should really be looking at how can you move your apps to .NET 5, .NET 6.
Mm-hmm. So with .NET 6 there, Microsoft's documentation still has the word core in it when talking about web applications. Is that significant, or what do people need to know there?
Yeah, so in the original framework, you had ASP.NET, which was the web framework for doing .NET. When you moved to .NET Core, it was called ASP.NET Core. And the trouble is, if you drop the core off ASP.NET Core, you get back to ASP.NET, but it's not the same ASP.NET as before. So the web framework is, as far as I know, always going to be called ASP.NET Core to differentiate it from that previous framework. So now you have ASP.NET Core that just runs on .NET 6.
Okay. So what is your favorite method at the moment for web applications on top of .NET? For a while, there were quite a few people, layering on JavaScript frameworks and other things, mixing and matching. And what's your preferences now with everything available in .NET 6?
Well, for a start, there is a lot available in .NET 6. That's one of the best bits. So it really depends what type of application you're trying to build. I'm quite a fan of Razor Pages, which is a sort of just server-side rendered, and is essentially a successor to MVC with Razor. It's all essentially the same components under the hood, but it has a much nicer sort of page-based feel to it. So if you're doing server-side rendering, I think going with that works well. If you're creating APIs, then you've got two options now in .NET 6. You've got the traditional sort of web API controller-based framework, which is a lot nicer than in the previous version in ASP.NET, because now MVC and web API are all part of the same framework, so you don't have the conflicting namespaces and things like that. So if you're moving from ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core, I would stick with the web API controllers. If you're starting a new application and you want to have APIs and you don't need a lot of like the filters and layers of complexity which you can achieve with web API, but you don't necessarily want, then minimal APIs are a really good option. And then on top of that, you've got gRPC, which is an alternative to HTTP. So you can use that for server-to-server communication particularly, and that's blazingly fast. And then you've got Blazor in its two forms. So you've either got Blazor WASM, which is a client-side framework, which essentially replaces the Angular, React, JavaScript framework that you traditionally use. Admittedly, with some more bloat at the moment and caveats around its use, but that's the role that fills. And then you've got Blazor Server, which is a whole other thing entirely, which is sort of a client-side framework in that you are building, it's a component-based, sending diffs of the HTML across the wire to a client browser, but it's a stateful application. So it stays in memory on the server. And so you can directly access the database and things like that, but without having to create an API layer or anything like that. When you're working with Blazor WASM, you have to have your Blazor WASM, which runs on the client, and you have to have your server application, which runs on the server. With Blazor Server, you just have one application. And it's all trade-offs for whichever one you're choosing. And it really depends on the application and the clients that the customers you're going to be serving, and how it fits into the rest of your sort of application ecosystem.
Can I ask you a philosophical question? Does anyone really want web applications? And I ask that because I remember when web applications became popular, it was because installing new versions of software, which, by the way, at that point in time was all desktop software, was so freaking hard and cumbersome. And when there was a way to do something from a URL launched application, everyone said, yes, I hate installers. But does anyone want the web, or do they just not want to do installers?
I mean, I would argue that they do on the web. As personally, as a user, if there's a web version of the application, I'll normally just hit it, with the exception of some particularly graphics-based or not compute-intensive things. It really depends. I think that the fact that if you've got to get someone to install something on a computer, it's risky, and they've got to have a lot of trust, and they're committing to something if they install something on your computer. If you hit a URL, it's easy. You know, if you're doing public-facing things, you want it to make it as frictionless as possible for consumers. Yeah, and having an installer is a massive burden. That said, it also does have huge benefits, like deploying a fix to a web server can just be instant, invisible to customers, and they don't need to know. Whereas if you have to ship an update for an installer, that can be expensive, in terms of time and purely bandwidth. If you're going to be downloading 100 megabytes out of Azure every day, if you're releasing every day, that seems like that could start to add up.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was a loaded question with no real answer because there's so many different fragmented market segments. It's like, yes, there's a lot of people who do they do not want to install anything, even if it is super simple. So, well, your book, even though you're in the second edition, it focuses on web applications in .NET Core 5.6. I want to ask about a few parts of it that really popped out at me in your table of contents, and one of them is testing your applications. A part of your book talking about that. That is something that still is not, in my observation, is not a either widely taught or widely adopted skill set among web programmers. What's your philosophy and experience and guidance on testing .NET web applications?
Yeah, so I mean, I can still sort of understand why people don't do it or don't know about it when there's so many new software developers. And I remember myself, like I wasn't taught that you need to test things. I tested things by clicking through the URL, making sure it all worked. That's how I always just thought that's how you tested stuff.
That's how
and
we all
even
do
when
it,
yeah, exactly. Even when I found out that about unit tests, I was like, well, why would I write more code to do things? That seems like it's just going to be slower. And I feel like you need to experience the difference that having good set of testing can bring you, and realizing that you can ship something and have confidence that it's actually going to work by having that suite of tests around things. I mean, it's not a panacea. Like, obviously, there's limits to what you can catch, and there's a limit to the benefits that you can get from either unit testing or integration testing. But I think these days, I can't imagine shipping an app to production without having a good suite of tests around it to know that we're actually shipping something that's working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's the new Playwright testing framework that Microsoft has been putting out there. Do you know anything about that, or what's the latest through the UI method that developers should be looking at?
So I haven't. I've seen it, but I haven't actually used it at all. I've always focused on the the sort of subcutaneous level. Like, so in the API testing, ideally actually against the database, because I find that you can abstract all that away. You can plug in like the different sort of SQL-like providers, which can be very useful. But I think with the advent of things like Docker and even SQL Server runs in Docker now and things like this, I quite like having where you can spin up an actual instance of the database and you hit the actual database and make sure that everything's coming back and the database state is as you like afterwards. So I've always focused on that sort of layer just below the UI where things get messy.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
Well, another part of that you go in detail in your book is configuring ASP.NET Core applications. And you get the startup CS. Am I the only one that sees over time that startup class getting really unwieldy with every library that you adopt wants a few more lines of code in that one magic class? How do we deal with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, in .NET6, there's no startup class. So
you have, you're now it's all in program, but still, I mean, you have that one class that everybody wants to run a few lines of startup code. Is there any kind of structure or pattern that people should be thinking about to keep that class from just bloating?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sort of joking about the startup, but it's the getting rid of startup and moving it all into program kind of highlights the fact that you do actually have to do something about this. You have to control this bloat. One way I always used to have it was essentially creating modules, which were just static registration classes. So if you have a module which is dealing with your employees, say, then you'd have a register employee services method. And then when you go back to your startup configure services method, or program TS now, you'd see services like add employer module, add customer module, add repairs module, whatever. So I quite like that. It keeps your program class clean, but you can easily navigate to where you're actually doing all these registrations.
So correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm hearing you right, what I think that means is if I'm adopting, I don't know, Infragistics components or some other library, and they say, oh, to use us, put these 3 lines in your startup or your program class, you're saying don't put them there, put them somewhere else in a class that I write, and then have that 1 line of code to that class that I wrote in Program CS.
That is what I tend to do, and to have common sort of collections of components together. But I mean, the reality is you can do anything you want. It is just a method call. So any sort of way that you can break it up yourself to make it more readable, maybe it isn't more readable to have it. Maybe you do just have a registrations class and you just stick it all in there. Maybe that's fine. And I'd argue that, initially that's almost certainly fine. Initially, you can put everything in there. It's only when it gets to a point where you're like, what is going on here? That breaking it out would actually make sense.
Well, if you have a house for you and your family, but your family is basically yourself and I, because you're not even married, don't have any kids, you could have efficiency one. You could live in a hotel room and it wouldn't even matter. But as you grow, it's like, oh, maybe I need a floor plan. Maybe I need more than just one room. It's the same thing with software, isn't it? If your application's tiny, you don't need much structure. Exactly.
And I think that's part of the pushback that everyone has had with some of the like minimal APIs and minimal hosting things in .NET 6, because they're very the examples and the demonstrations are all very focused around the getting started experience, and it's like a small application, and everyone's always worried that, well, if you're putting all of your APIs in the same file, that program file is now 300 lines long, and it's just going to keep growing. It's just going to keep growing. But that's sort of missing the point that you can just move them elsewhere. There's nothing forcing you to tie stuff in. The way the newer versions of ASP.NET Core are, they rely far less on conventions and you have to do it this way, as you can configure it any way you want, or you could write a little. I'm sure there's frameworks essentially which sit on top and give you back that structure if you want to have a structure. It's definitely something that you can impose, but it's not required to be in the actual framework itself, which is quite nice.
Right. It's easy to say, oh yeah, just invent a pattern for yourself and refactor things out, and I'll do it. But there's somebody out there listening who has the interest in being an open source author, creating something, and I will say, your opinion, it's super useful to have a NuGet package out there where all it does is give us a canned implementation of some type of pattern, and an organized program CS for larger and growing applications, I think is needed out there. And so if anybody out there just wants to build it and wants to just get in contact with me and come on the show and we'll pitch it, I think it's a gap. It's something that would be hugely useful, because the normal programmer out there is not going to invent the right pattern for themselves. It's kind of like we need some pattern out there. It's like, oh yeah, that one's good. Okay, let's just use that one.
Yeah, so there is actually already started to be this growing up, less around the startup hosting side, but around the minimal APIs, because the minimal APIs are very much just, it feels like they're all going to be listed in one file, but you don't want to get to that point. So there's Carter, which is quite a well-known open source package, which has been sort of essentially ported to minimal APIs. It was almost like the inspiration to minimal APIs in a lot of ways, I think, because it provides a very similar syntax. But it basically is built now entirely on minimal APIs, as far as I know. But it provides that module kind of structure, so it adds that layer on top and provides some convenience methods around that. And then there's another one, fast endpoints, which I've heard about but haven't looked at, which combines minimal APIs with sort of a mediator pattern, so you can get that all in one without having to do all that yourself. So there is growing this structure and these new patterns.
Oh, that's a good point. We'll make sure to include those in our show notes. I think fast-endpoints.com.
I think that's the one. Yeah.
And is it Kartra? I'm not familiar with that one.
Sorry, Carter.
Carta. Okay, well, we'll include that in the show notes as well, just to get the right URL. That's good. All these little frameworks, I mean, no one person can know all of them, but pass the word, hey, this one could be useful. Go check it out.
Exactly. And they all have slightly different patterns and slightly different paradigms, and so it's about finding the one that sort of works for you and sort of jives with the way you like to build your applications.
Right. And by the way, if anybody's making fun of me for not already knowing all these new frameworks popping up, sometime listener, you're gonna get to the point where you can't even keep anything straight anymore, and boom, right back at you.
Yeah, like you say, it's so easy to start things now. It's so hard to keep on top of them all. I mean, the fast endpoints one I only heard on a podcast a few weeks ago. So it's just
nice.
It's a great way to learn about things.
Nice. All right, I want to keep on. The table of contents of your book is outstanding. It covers so much. And by the way, I asked you another question about it, but you have an offer. You're promoting a book offer at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, so we've got a discount code for it. I'll have to get that to you. But there's also we've got a free book you can give away, ebook version, which I will send you a code for.
Awesome. All right, we'll make sure to include that code in the show notes. And so just wherever you're listening to the podcast, pop open the show notes and you'll be able to get that. Authentication, or just logging in, playing a log. There's been so many solutions on how to log in to a web application. And now, of course, we have Auth0. We have, sign in as Microsoft 365, sign in as Google, or all those providers. There's so many options out there. Can you whittle down the options? Which ones would you recommend? Or like, oh yeah, you really should just pick from these several.
I mean, again, it depends what you need to do. I'm quite fond of not writing your own auth. That's it's something people always feel I need to do. I need to have my users table. I need to have my username and password. I need to collect all these extra details. I need to handle all that myself. That is just such a huge effort to do in your application. And even with the ASP.NET Core identity sort of framework, which is built in, you can do that. You certainly can do that. Do you want to do that? Is a whole separate thing. So I would encourage people to use a third-party provider if you can, whether it is Auth0 or Okta or
which are now both one company.
Which, I just suddenly realized that. Or Microsoft B2C, or depending on which sort of platform works best for you. They're all pretty much the same these days. They are all providing OpenID Connect capabilities, which means you can plug them into your application pretty easily. And as far as I know, there's some improvements going to be happening to that in .NET 7, I believe. There's been talk about those being improved. The other major one is Identity Server, or Duende, which is essentially lets you build your own identity platform, which, again, if you can get away without doing that, would be great. But if you do need to do it, it provides everything there. I've done that before, and it's so extensible that you essentially run a standalone application, which is like an Auth0. You run your own Auth0 essentially, and then all of your other internal applications or external applications can all authenticate via that one system. So it gives you a single sign-on throughout your all of your apps, and that you need them. But again, if you don't need to, just don't do your own auth system.
Yeah. There was a time that I remember where someone was building or having built their first web application. And so it was, nobody logs into anything. I guess we need to have a way to do that. But it seems like today, every one of the potential users is already logging into something from the company in some fashion. Whereas if you're making those design decisions, they might already be made for us. Where how are they already logging in? Okay, well, we needed to tap into that and just use that. You agree with that general method?
Absolutely. Like if your company, for example, uses, let's say, Microsoft accounts or a Google account, if they're already authenticated with that, you can plug in, again, using the OpenID Connect protocol. It's most the big providers certainly support that. That's it. That's all you need. You'll get back the user sort of ID, and that's all you care about. You know that the user is authenticated. You know who they are, and you don't have to worry about any of that sort of protection of the accounts. If someone tries to spoof the account, if they try to brute force a password, all of these third-party providers like Google and Microsoft, they're all detecting these things. They're all blocking it for you, and it's not on you. You don't have any passwords to lose. You don't have any anything like that. So that is definitely the approach to take. And it's so much easier.
Yeah, for sure. And as we kind of get to the end of our time here, I wanted to make sure that I asked you about custom components. It's another section of your book, and this is another one where, just in my own observations, not enough developers choose to build custom applications when it's a great opportunity, and they just sling more HTML, more CSS, and more basic controls instead of making higher level components. What's your thinking on that?
So yeah, the custom components in there is normally when so things like injecting validation and using creating custom validation providers in .NET. It's things where you reach the sort of the edges of what you can get out of the box, and it can be it's super useful. It can get you out of just holes that you would otherwise be trying to spend ages working around, and it's not essential as a beginner, but if you can learn how things work actually under the hood, then you can tap into these so easily. This is partly why I started the blog, was basically just sort of looking through the source code, finding out all these little edges that you can hook into quite happily. They're public, but they're not necessarily as well known as other bits, because you don't need them most of the time. But when you do need them, they can just solve your problems incredibly easily.
Yeah. I kind of think it like object-oriented development in C#. You make a decision on when to make another object, which is a composition of other ones, and it's just kind of doing the same thing in the user interface.
Yeah. If you're from that sort of that larger component view, that's sort of in the sort of Blazor component style. I completely agree. Like you start with little ones and then you make a bigger one, and then it's nested by that. Suddenly it makes it easier to compose your applications with these entire controls. And then there is a big third party. Like you said, there's a big third party market for those now. There's all of the big providers have jumped in with various Blazor controls like Telerik and Infragistics and things like you say, and they're really good.
They're so good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, man. Any listeners out there that are not at least piloting and seeing what's out there from the commercial standpoint, oh gosh, they're so good. They can save so much time, so much code. So
absolutely.
Well, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the Azure DevOps podcast. We'll make sure that everything we talked about, include that in the show notes and the code for the free ebook, and as well as links to everything, including andrewlock.net, your awesome blog that you keep trucking along on, and ASP.NET Core in Action, the book from Manning Publishers. So, is there anything else that the listeners should hear before we sign off for today?
No, that's great. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Hey, the pleasure's all mine. Thanks so much. Well, that includes our show for today with Andrew Lock, and that special offer, a free book. We're going to do a random drawing, and so for the first couple weeks, this podcast is out from publication date. Just if you want to get in on the drawing, if you want to email me at Jeffrey, Jeffrey, at clear-measure.com, and we'll do 14 days from the publication of this episode, and then do a drawing, and we'll hook you up with Andrew Lock so that you can get the free book. And for everyone else, we will be distributing the discount code in the show notes. So until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.